There is a moment in every person's life when the world looks at them and decides they are nothing, not dangerous, not worthy, not even worth a second glance, just nothing. And the cruelest part? The world usually laughs while it does it. This is a story about one of those moments. Except this time, the world got it catastrophically wrong. His name was Sergeant Alexander Nowak, 29 years old, 6 feet of silence wrapped in a ceremonial uniform that looked, to most tourists, like something out of a theme park. The tall black bearskin hat, the red and gold tunic, the polished boots that reflected the gray London sky like mirrors. He stood at his post outside the palace gates the same way he had stood there for 4 years, spine straight, jaw locked, eyes fixed somewhere past the horizon, past the crowd, past the noise. The crowd on that particular Tuesday morning was bigger than usual. A school trip had arrived. 47 kids from a secondary school in Yorkshire, all of them buzzing with the particular energy of children who have been freed from classrooms and let loose on a capital city. They poured through the gates in a wave of backpacks and matching lanyards, and their teachers moved behind them like exhausted border collies trying to keep sheep in formation. It didn't take long. It never does. One boy, 13, maybe 14, wearing a hoodie with a football club logo and the particular confidence of someone who has never been properly humbled, spotted Alexander and immediately broke away from the group. He walked right up to the barrier, close enough that Alexander could see the chocolate bar wrapper sticking out of his jacket pocket, and he stared, just stared, the way you stare at a statue. Then he turned to his friends and grinned. "Watch this," he said. He made a face, a ridiculous, exaggerated face, tongue out, eyes crossed, arms flapping. His friends erupted. A few of the adults nearby smiled. Someone raised their phone, because this is what tourists do, what bored teenagers do, what people have done to royal guards for generations. They test the stillness. They poke the statue. They perform for each other at the expense of the man who cannot respond. Alexander did not move. He never moved. The boy escalated. He started doing impressions, pretending to be a robot, narrating in a fake posh accent. "I am the Queen's very important guard, and I cannot move because I have a stick up my," his friends howled. More phones came out. The video was already being filmed, the caption probably already forming in someone's mind. Another clip. Another laughingstock guard. Another piece of internet fodder. Still, Alexander did not move. Not a twitch. Not a blink. The wind shifted his tunic slightly. That was all. A woman nearby, American accent, wide-brimmed sun hat, leaned toward her husband and said loudly enough for several people to hear, "What is even the point of them? They're just decorations. They're not real soldiers." The husband laughed. "Yeah, they just stand there. It's like a human statue act." The boy, emboldened now, stepped even closer. His friend, phone raised, was recording everything. "Oi, can you even hear me? Hello? Anyone home? Do they turn off at night? Do they plug him into the wall?" More laughter. A ripple through the crowd. The teachers were looking away, the way adults sometimes do when they know they should intervene, but the moment feels too awkward and harmless to bother. Alexander's eyes moved. Not dramatically, not a snap, just a slow, deliberate shift. His gaze dropped from the middle distance and landed, heavy and calm and absolutely certain, directly on the boy's face. The boy stopped laughing. He took a small step back. Just one. But he took it. Alexander's eyes returned to the horizon. The crowd felt it, that shift in temperature, even if they couldn't name it. The laughter quieted. Not because anything had happened. Because something had almost happened. Because for 1 second, the statue had looked at them, and the look said, "I know exactly where I am, and exactly who I am, and exactly what I'm capable of, and none of those things have anything to do with what you think of me right now." The boy rejoined his group. He didn't say anything else, but the phone stayed raised. The video kept recording. Because the crowd wanted what all crowds want, a reaction, a stumble, something to take home. They wanted the uniform to crack. They wanted to see the man inside it bend under the weight of being laughed at. They wanted confirmation that this was, in fact, just a costume, just a performance, just decoration, like the American woman said. What they didn't know what they couldn't know, standing there on a gray Tuesday morning with their phones and their snacks and their comfortable assumption that a man in a ceremonial uniform must be ceremonial, was who Alexander Nowak actually was. They didn't know about the 8 years before the palace gates, the training that began when he was 19 and nearly broke 3 times before it made him, the selection process that removed 70% of candidates in the first month. They didn't know about the deployments. They didn't know about the mission in 2019 that he is still not legally permitted to describe in detail, the one that earned him a commendation he keeps in a shoebox under his bed because he does not own a display case and has never thought to buy one. They didn't know about his instructor, a man named Corporal Dennis Bartak, who told him on his first day, "The hardest thing you will ever do is stand completely still while people decide you are nothing. Because everything in you will want to prove them wrong. Your job is to not need to." They didn't know any of it. They saw a hat, a tunic, a prop. What they were looking at was one of the most rigorously trained soldiers in the British Armed Forces, standing at his post with the same discipline and focus he would bring to a combat situation. Because to him, there was no difference. The post was the post. The mission was the mission. The fact that children were laughing at him instead of bullets passing over him changed nothing about how he approached the task. But even Alexander could not have predicted what was about to happen. It started quietly, the way the most significant things always do. A sound from the far end of the gate. Not laughter, not a tourist shout, something lower, a scuffle, the specific sound of surprise, of weight hitting pavement, of a situation changing faster than anyone can process. Alexander heard it before anyone else registered it. His body knew what it was before his mind formed the words. His eyes moved again. This time they didn't come back to the horizon. 20 meters away, near the edge of the crowd where the tourist cluster thinned out, a man had grabbed a woman's bag. Not a gentle snatch, a violent yank that had pulled her sideways off balance. And now she was going down, and he was already running, moving fast through the gap in the crowd, and people were stumbling back, and someone screamed, and the crowd split like water around a stone, and suddenly there was a clear line between the man running and Alexander. He moved. For years of standing still, and he moved, and the crowd that had been laughing 30 seconds ago lurched backward because this was not a statue anymore. This was not a decoration. This was not a prop from a history book. This was a soldier at a dead sprint covering 20 meters in a time that didn't seem physically possible for a man in polished ceremonial boots. And the boy in the football hoodie dropped his phone, and the American woman grabbed her husband's arm, and the man with the stolen bag looked back once, just once. And what he saw in Alexander's face made him run harder. But it didn't help. The crowd watched, frozen, phones forgotten. Nobody was filming anymore. The boy in the hoodie stood completely still. For once. The man's name was Carl Briggs, 31 years old, 3 prior arrests, 2 of which had resulted in nothing more serious than a caution and a court date he didn't attend. He was not a professional thief in any organized sense of the word. He was a man who had made a series of small bad choices over a long period of time and had arrived at a Tuesday morning outside a palace believing, the way people in his situation often do, that he was invisible, that the tourists were easy, that the guards were furniture. He was wrong about all of it, but he was most catastrophically wrong about the last one. Alexander covered the distance between his post and Briggs in under 6 seconds. This is not an exaggeration or a dramatic flourish. It is simply what happened, and the people who saw it struggled to describe it afterward because the human brain tends to fill in gaps with what it expects, and nobody expected the statue to move like that. The CCTV footage later showed it plainly. Post to contact in 5.8 seconds, which is the kind of time that belongs to men who have spent years training their bodies to go from complete stillness to full explosive movement without a warm-up, without a moment of hesitation, without the half-second lag that most people have between deciding to do something and actually doing it. Briggs had a head start, a crowd to navigate through, and fear driving him forward. It wasn't enough. The takedown was clean, professional, the kind that has been practiced so many times it happens below the level of conscious thought. Weight redistribution, control of the wrists, a controlled descent to the ground that looked, to the crowd watching, both utterly inevitable and somehow gentle, in a way that a skilled thing often looks effortless from the outside. Briggs went down. He didn't hit the pavement badly. He wasn't hurt. He was simply no longer moving. Alexander held him there, one knee beside him, not on him, a posture of absolute control, without cruelty. The stolen bag lay 2 feet away on the pavement, its contents, a wallet, a tube of sunscreen, a folded tourist map, a phone with a cracked screen, scattered across the gray stone. The woman Briggs had grabbed was being helped up by 2 bystanders. She was shaken, her knees scraped from the fall, tears running down a face that had gone white with shock. She looked at the man on the ground. She looked at Alexander. She opened her mouth, and nothing came out. Just a breath. Around them, the crowd stood in a silence, so complete you could hear the traffic on the far side of the gates. Then, someone started clapping. It began at the back. 1 person, then 2, then a sound that built the way a wave builds. Slow at first, then suddenly, everywhere, and the children from Yorkshire who had been laughing 10 minutes ago were clapping louder than anyone. The boy in the football hoodie clapping hardest of all, his face doing something complicated and private that 13-year-old boys don't usually let themselves show in public. Alexander did not react to the applause. He was already looking past it. Already on comms, his radio activated, his voice low and precise. Location, description, situation contained, medical assessment needed for a civilian, bag theft, 1 detained, awaiting backup. His voice had the same tone he used for everything. Flat, factual, unhurried. The voice of a man reporting on the weather in a country where the weather is never a surprise. The backup arrived in under 4 minutes. 2 Metropolitan Police officers who took Briggs into custody with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this many times before. They exchanged a few words with Alexander. One of them, a woman about 10 years older than him, looked at his uniform and said something that made him make a very small sound that might, to a very attentive observer, have been the beginning of a laugh. She had said, "Nice hat." The American woman with the sun hat had moved to the edge of the crowd. Her husband was beside her. She was not talking. She was watching Alexander walk back to his post, back to the exact spot where he had been standing, spine straight, jaw locked, eyes returning to that point somewhere past the horizon, and her face was doing the thing that faces do when a person is quietly revising every assumption they walked into a morning carrying. She said nothing. Her husband said nothing. There was nothing to say, but the video existed. Not the video the boy had been filming during the taunting. That one had ended when the phone hit the pavement. No, this was a different video, captured by a man named Theo Vasquez, a freelance photographer from Madrid who had been standing at the back of the crowd, trying to get a clean shot of the palace facade for a travel piece he was writing. He had turned his camera toward the commotion reflexively, the way photographers do, and he had captured everything from the moment Alexander's eyes shifted to the moment the applause began. He posted it that evening with a simple caption, "Buscaba una foto del palacio. Encontré esto en su lugar." I was looking for a photo of the palace. I found this instead. By midnight, it had 40,000 views. By the following morning, it had crossed 3 million. The reason it spread so fast was not the takedown itself. Takedowns happen. What made the video different, what made people watch it twice, 3 times, send it to their group chats with no message, just the link because the link said everything, was the sequence before it. The footage of the boy taunting. The laughter from the crowd. The American woman's audible comment. All of it captured. All of it sitting there on film for the world to see. And then the movement. People watch a man be dismissed as decoration, stand in that dismissal without flinching, and then respond to a real crisis with a speed and precision that made the crowd's assumptions collapse in real time. The video didn't need a caption more than the one it had. The contrast did all the work. Comment sections are rarely worth reading, but this one had a texture that stood out. Alongside the predictable noise, there were veterans posting quietly. This is what discipline actually looks like. There were people who had worked in security, in emergency response, in roles that require the ability to stay absolutely still until absolute stillness is no longer the right tool. And they recognize something. There are people who had never thought about what a ceremonial guard actually was, what the selection and training actually involved, and we're now at 11 on a Wednesday morning reading Wikipedia articles about the household division and feeling something shifting in their understanding of the world. The boy in the football hoodie was in some of those comments. He had found the video. He recognized himself. He posted 3 words under his own taunting face and deleted it an hour later, but not before it had been screenshot by enough people to make it permanent. The 3 words were, "I was wrong." 3 words. Maximum viable unit. It did more than a paragraph could have. Back in London, Alexander Nowak returned to work on Wednesday morning the same way he returned every morning. He ate breakfast in the barracks. He checked his kit. He took the bus. He walked to his post. He did not know about the video. Not yet. He knew about the incident because there had been paperwork, a brief interview with his superior, and a commendation in progress that his CEO had mentioned in the tone of a man who finds formal praise slightly embarrassing to deliver. He knew that the woman whose bag was stolen had sent a note to the regiment, handwritten, on paper that smelled faintly of the same sunscreen that had rolled out of her bag onto the pavement. He knew these things the way he knew most things about himself, with minimal ceremony. What he didn't know was that 3 million people had spent the past 24 hours looking at him. His sister told him. She called him at 6:15 in the evening, while he was eating dinner, and her first words were, "Alexander, I need you to look something up." Her voice had a quality he hadn't heard from her in years, a brightness that was also a kind of relief, like someone setting down a weight they'd been carrying for a long time on someone else's behalf. He looked it up. He watched the video once. He put his phone face down on the table and finished his dinner. His sister, still on the line, said, "Are you going to say anything?" He thought about it. "Nice shot," he said. The photographer had good timing. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry and was very particularly the sound of a sibling who has spent years watching someone they love be underestimated by a world that mistakes silence for absence. Outside, the city moved the way cities do, indifferent and continuous and full of people who were somewhere in their feeds encountering a video they couldn't quite stop watching, trying to name what it was making them feel. It wasn't just admiration. It was closer to embarrassment. The specific embarrassment of realizing you have been casually dismissing something that was quietly, patiently, completely extraordinary. The feeling of having walked past a painting in a gallery every day for a year, mistaking it for a reproduction, and then learning it was the original. In a regiment that does not issue press releases or make statements or grant interviews to people who post videos on the internet, one officer, speaking anonymously to a journalist who was already writing the story, said only, "Sergeant Nowak did his job." That's it. That's the whole story. It wasn't the whole story, but it was the center of it, and the center was holding. The world had looked at Alexander Nowak and decided he was nothing. A hot, a tunic, a prop, and he had stood in that judgment with the same discipline he brought to everything. Not because he needed the world to be wrong, not because he was waiting for the moment that would prove them wrong, but because the judgment was simply not relevant to what he was doing there. He was there to do his job. He had done it. Everything else, the laughter, the applause, the 3 million views, the boy's deleted 3-word comment, the American woman revising her morning's assumptions on a bus back to her hotel, all of it was weather. It moved through. He stood. But the world had seen something. And what the world does with the things it sees, how it carries them, how they change the next thing it looks at, that part was still unfolding. It would keep unfolding. For a long time. The internet moves like weather. Fast, directionless, and gone before you can name it. Most viral moments dissolve within a week, absorbed into the endless feed, buried under the next thing, forgotten the way that most convenient emotions are forgotten. People move on. The algorithm moves on. The feeling of having been briefly moved by something becomes indistinguishable, in time, from having felt nothing at all. This one didn't dissolve. It had a quality that the others didn't, a weight to it, something that snagged in people's minds the way real things snag. Not because it was dramatic or spectacular, but because it was true. Undeniably, plainly true. You could watch it 20 times, and it did not lose anything. It did not depend on a trick of angle or editing. What it showed was exactly what it was, and what was turned out to be the kind of story that people had stopped expecting to find in a 10-second clip on their phone. A story about dignity. About what it looks like when someone knows exactly who they are in the middle of a crowd telling them they're nobody. The video's spread moved through predictable phases. First, the travel and military communities. Then, the general feeds. Then, the places where it acquired commentary. The ex-soldiers posting with quiet recognition. The teachers sharing it in staff group chats with no context. Because no context was needed, the parents sending it to their teenage children with a look at this energy that teenagers usually resist, but, in this case, oddly, didn't. Then, it reached the journalism. The first pieces were what you'd expect. Factual recaps, timeline of events, some background on household division's training standards, the usual framing of a feel-good story about an unsung hero. Competent work. The kind of article that gets read once and bookmarked and never open again. But then something else started happening in the commentary around the story. Something less comfortable, harder to package. People started talking about what they had done. Not in an abstract, general sense. In a specific, first-person sense. A thread appeared on a forum. Not a major platform, a small one, the kind populated mostly by people who have given up on the larger ones, where someone had started a post that read simply, "Have you ever done the tourist thing? Stood in front of a guard and performed for your friends?" And the thread filled up, not with bragging, with something more honest than that. I did it when I was 16 in Edinburgh. I made a whole show of it, and my mates thought it was hilarious. I'm 34 now, and I've thought about it more than once. My dad and I did this. I thought it was funny. We have a photo somewhere. I don't frame it. I was in a school group once. I didn't participate, but I watched and I laughed, and I've always felt strange about it. I did the bit where you pretend they're robots. I was 22, which is old enough to have known better. It wasn't a big thread. It wasn't viral, but it had a texture that the larger conversation lacked, the specific texture of people processing something privately, in writing, in a space small enough to be honest in. Not performing guilt, not competing over who felt the worst, just sitting with the thing they'd done and asking themselves what it said about them. The thread did not reach Alexander Nowak, but something else did. A letter arrived at the regiment 3 weeks after the video, addressed simply to the guard from the video in handwriting that suggested an older person, deliberate and slightly formal. The regiment's correspondence officer, a woman named Harriet who had been managing mail for 12 years and had a finely calibrated sense for which letters needed to be passed along and which needed only to be filed, read it and put in a different pile. She brought it to Alexander's CO. The letter was from a man named Arthur Fenwick, 73 years old, retired, living in a suburb of Bristol. He had been a soldier himself, 40 years prior, and had served not in any famous theater, not in any conflict that made into documentaries, in the ordinary, grinding, invisible work of military service that most people never see and therefore never think about. He had stood his share of posts. He had been laughed at a share of times. He had watched the video 4 times, he wrote, and on the 4th time he had found himself crying in a way he could not immediately explain to his wife, who had come into the room and found him there. He wrote, "I don't think I'm crying for you. I think I'm crying for everyone who did the same thing you did and never had a single person see it. All the men and women who stood perfectly still in the middle of being dismissed, who held their post and did their job and went home, and nobody filmed it, nobody applauded, nobody shared it 3 million times. You had a good day, and I'm glad you had it. But I wanted someone to know that you're not unique in what you did. You're just the one who got seen." The CO passed the letter to Alexander without comment. Alexander read it at his desk in the barracks during the 15 minutes between briefing and his shift change. He folded it carefully along its original creases. He put it in his jacket pocket. He carried it for the rest of the day. The boy in the football hoodie had been thinking about a letter of his own. Not in any formal sense. He was 14 years old and had never written a letter to anyone who wasn't a relative, and the process felt enormous and ridiculous in equal measure. But the idea wouldn't leave him. It had installed itself somewhere behind his sternum and sat there for 3 weeks, occasionally applying pressure. His name was Jamie Okafor. His mother was a nurse. His father drove long-distance transport. He was a good student, mostly the kind who worked hard at things that interested him and coasted on the rest, which is a reasonable description of most 14-year-olds and nothing to be ashamed of. He played football on weekends. He had a group chat that was mostly memes and arguments about music. He was, by any reasonable measure, a normal kid living a normal life. The video had done something to his normal life. Not dramatically, not in a way he could have easily explained to his friends, which is why he hadn't tried. It was more like a recalibration, a slow, quiet revision of certain things he had assumed without examining. He had assumed that the guards were a bit of theater, that the uniform was a costume, that the whole thing was essentially a tourist attraction that happened to involve real people, and that the real people inside it had somehow agreed to be treated as part of the scenery. He hadn't thought about it consciously. He had simply absorbed it from the world around him, the way you absorb most of the assumptions you carry, without noticing, without asking, without anyone pointing out that you're doing it. The video had pointed it out. In the most clear and specific way possible, it had pointed out, this is not a costume. This is not a prop. This is a person who contains depths you never looked for because you had already decided what he was. Jamie thought about this on the bus, in class, at football practice where his mind wandered at set pieces and his coach shouted at him to focus and he nodded and refocused and the thought came back 20 minutes later. He thought about it in the context of the guard and then the way thoughts do when you give them room, he started thinking about it in other contexts. The dinner lady at school who he had always walked past without really seeing. The man at the corner shop who his friends made jokes about for reasons that dissolved under any scrutiny. The teaching assistant in Year 9 maths who everyone called boring and who had, last month, quietly helped him understand a concept he'd been stuck on for a week and who he had thanked with barely a word before packing up and leaving. The dinner lady's name, he realized, he did not know. He found out the next day. Her name was Margaret. She had worked at the school for 11 years. She had a daughter at university in Newcastle studying veterinary science. She liked gardening. She told him all of this in the time it took him to reach the front of the lunch queue because she was the kind of person who, once someone actually asked, had a great deal to say and had simply been waiting, not bitterly, not even consciously, for someone to ask. He thanked her for the food. He used her name. Margaret looked at him with an expression that was so small and so contained that anyone watching would have missed it. A brief softening, a slight lift. The expression of someone who has been seen casually and without ceremony by someone who didn't need to bother. Jamie didn't overthink it. He just moved on down the line, but he carried it. The other thing that happened, the thing that nobody could have anticipated when Alexander was just a man at a post being laughed at by a school trip, was what happened in classrooms. 3 teachers, independently, on 3 different continents, in the weeks following the video, used the footage as a discussion prompt with their students. The questions they asked varied. One was a philosophy teacher in Toronto who asked her students what the video said about the relationship between performance and substance. One was a history teacher in Cape Town who used it as a way into a broader conversation about military service and its public perception. One was a secondary school teacher in Birmingham, not far, actually, from the school Jamie attended, who simply played it and then said, "What do you notice?" The Birmingham class's response was recorded by the teacher, who later wrote about it in an education journal. The students, mostly 15 and 16 years old, had noticed the same thing the internet had noticed, but articulated it in ways that cut closer to the bone than most of the viral commentary had. One student said, "The crowd thought the laugh was free, like it didn't cost anything, but it cost the guard something. Even if he didn't show it, Being laughed at always costs something. Another said, "The thing that got me was that he didn't change. He was the same person before and after. We were the ones who changed. We just needed a reason." That second comment was the one the teacher quoted in her article. We just needed a reason. The reason had been the crisis, the running, the 6 seconds of movement that collapsed 4 years of assumption in under a minute. The crowd had needed something spectacular to see what was already there. The thing that was already there did not need the spectacular. It existed regardless. This is what Arthur Fenwick had been crying about. This is what the thread on the forum had been sitting with. This is what Margaret felt when Jamie used her name. The video went on existing in the way that things on the internet go on existing. Permanent, retrievable, occasionally resurfaced. It appeared in a compilation about extraordinary real-life moments. It appeared in a recruiting video for the British Armed Forces, briefly, though it was removed when Alexander, who had been asked for permission and given it without enthusiasm, quietly requested through his CEO that it not be used for promotional purposes. It appeared in a stranger's Instagram caption, accompanying a photo of a ceremonial guard taken on a different day, a different guard, a different post, but accompanied by the words, "After what I saw last month, I will never walk past one of these men without thinking about what they carry." Alexander Nowak continued to stand at his post. He received Arthur Fenwick's letter, and, after a period of thought that lasted about 2 weeks, he wrote back. His response was shorter than Arthur's. He was not a man who used many words when fewer would do, but it said one thing clearly: "You're right. Thank you for saying it for them." He did not know, when he wrote it, that Arthur Fenwick would read that line aloud to his wife at the kitchen table, and that his wife would fold her hands and say nothing because some things sit better in silence than in response. He did not know that Jamie Okafor would go on, the following year, to volunteer for a community program that put him in regular contact with veterans, initially because of a school requirement, and subsequently because he found, to his own surprise, that he was good at sitting with people who needed to be seen because he had learned, at 14, that seeing people is not a grand gesture, is a practice, the same small act repeated every day without ceremony. He did not know about the teacher's article, or the forum thread, or the 3 million people who had watched the video more than once, and come away carrying something they couldn't quite name. He knew what he knew. His post, his kit, the gray London sky, the crowds that came and went with their phones and their assumptions and their complicated human faces. The work. He stood. The world turned the way it does, indifferent and continuous, full of people who were somewhere in their days making small choices about whether to see each other. Really see each other, past the uniform, past the costume, past the role, down to the person underneath who has a history and a discipline and a letter folded in a jacket pocket and a sister who makes sounds that are not quite laughs. Full of people learning, slowly, the way all important things are learned, that what something looks like from the outside is almost never what it is, and that the cost of assuming otherwise is always paid by someone else. Always.